Hello and welcome to SimCast, the Higher Education Simulation Podcast. My name's Tony Jeremy. I'm the Academic Lead for Simulation-Based Education at UEA Norwich.
Hi everybody, my name's Lawrence Hill and I'm the Chair of the Simulation Group in the School of Health Sciences at UEA Norwich. A very warm welcome back to the podcast.
So Lawrence, today is part 5 of our 6-part series on the online component of our Sim Instructors course that we run here at UEA Norwich.
Yes, it is. And we are confident that these videos will equip you with the necessary understanding and theoretical underpinning to really get the best out of our one-day face-to-face simulation instructors course.
This episode is on delivering simulation. So, Lawrence, what are the learning outcomes for this?
The learning outcomes for this particular one, well, I think first of all, before we get into the learning outcomes, it's probably worth saying that in part 2, What is simulation safety, we considered the following learning outcomes: defining the basic assumption made about learners undertaking sim, outlining the importance of and describing aspects of safety in simulation, and appraising the concept of safety in simulation. Because effective simulation delivery really depends on keeping these in mind. So this video is concerned with the simulation event itself. So by the end of this video, you should be able to meet the following learning outcomes: understand the importance of a structured approach to simulation and to describe the phases of simulation delivery.
Great. So let's start with that structure then. So for me, there's 3 key phases when we're looking at simulation delivery itself. So the event on the day, you've got the briefing component, you've then got the action phase or the simulation event itself. And then you've got the debriefing phase. Now, debriefing is such an important component and unique component in itself. We're going to cover that in part 6. So today, we're going to be looking at the briefing and the action phase, the simulation event.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when we say a simulation briefing, what do we mean by a simulation briefing, do you think, Tony?
So there's a couple of things that need to be considered. So there's briefing for the facilitators, and this was in we sort of touched on this in sort of planning delivery of simulation. So that is an important aspect of briefing that you need to consider as a simulation facilitator. But then there's the briefing of the learners themselves, and I guess that's probably what we're more interested in today. Is briefing the learners.
Briefing the learners. So when we talk about briefing the learners, what is the purpose of that briefing, do you think?
So it's to start off by, again, using that basic assumption to create that ethos of learning and to try and move away from that often predetermined idea that simulation is an evaluation of performance rather than an opportunity to learn. And that's a key aspect of that briefing.
Reinforcing that this simulation is a learning event and that you're not being judged, even though you might feel a little bit like it at the moment. It's not a judgment, and we're just hopefully all going to learn something. And
I think the important thing to remember as well is as much effort as you put into that, you're still going to get people who think they're being evaluated and being judged. But it's not to say that you shouldn't put the effort in to sort of level that hierarchy and make people feel comfortable at the beginning of a simulation event.
So it's about, like you say, creating that supportive, nurturing, learning environment, creating that ethos. What else is it there for?
So I think it's an opportunity to preview and to identify what is to be expected from the simulation event. And again, it's I guess a common misconception that you have to hold things back. You have to have that element of surprise to make the simulation event unfold in a way which means that you're going to get the best out of learners. And actually, it probably does the opposite.
Generally speaking, surprise is bad. Because it's unsettling, isn't it?
But you don't have to give the game away. So if you've got a scenario which takes a certain path or route, you don't have to kind of spell it out. But for example, if you're coming to do a simulation scenario on how to do safety checks prior to surgery, for example, thinking about my background, it should be fairly apparent to the learners when they step into that briefing that this is what the day is going to revolve around. It's aspects of that, because it'll give the learners to use that prerequisite knowledge that they have and sort of tune into, okay, this is the area that I'm going to be kind of focusing on today.
And if one of your intended learning outcomes for that simulation is for the student to be able to address something that happens that's outside of the procedure, like something happens which may feel like a curve ball, say, that actually part of the briefing is about stating, and one of the outcomes might be to demonstrate how to navigate, an unexpected event occurring during your WHO checklist.
Yeah.
You know, and sort of saying you don't have to say what that's going to be, but letting someone know that there's probably going to be something that happens that you need to manage is really healthy.
Yeah, because if you spend the time doing the basic assumption and then sort of saying, this is an opportunity to learn, but then going, I'm going to trip you up at some point or another, you're just losing the faith in those learners.
Yeah, and you're going to erode their trust in you as an educator in due course as well. So it's about kind of creating that environment, but also giving that preview, so they're creating that sense of mission. What am I trying to achieve in this simulation? What are the intended outcomes? And that's something we've not stated yet, is it? So one of the purposes of that briefing is to clearly state what the intended learning outcomes are.
Yeah, and if you're going to put any slide up in a simulation event, it should be those learning outcomes, nice and clear at the beginning, and when we come back to it at the end, at the debrief as well, revisiting those learning outcomes. Have we achieved what we're aiming to? But of course, if you don't do that at the briefing, you've got nowhere to start from.
Right. Okay. So here's a question for you. We don't have intended learning outcomes when we go out into practice for placement. Why should we have them in simulation?
Because your simulation is a curated event, isn't it? It's designed specifically to look at certain areas of practice and to present challenges for your learners to try and overcome. Without a learning outcome, it's kind of just potentially a free-for-all. And this is when we can kind of get sucked in by the allure of the technology and start going off on tangents and then thinking, well, what did we actually achieve out of this? Other than throwing lots of expensive kit and making learners feel really uncomfortable in the process.
And spending time and resources doing that. Yeah, it's partly the reason we must have those really clear intended learning outcomes is because this simulation event is situated within the wider curriculum. This simulation event exists for a reason, to help learners ultimately achieve some kind of proficiency or standard.
And if anything, simulation then provides this vehicle to go to introduce harmony between sort of technical aspects, which learners might have learned and developed, but also non-technical aspects as well. So learning outcomes for me in simulation, you definitely need to have some technical ones, but you also need to have some non-technical ones. What was the team working like? What was the decision making? The prioritization, easy for me to say, communication skills, ironically.
Exactly. But those, and I completely, and that's one of the real beauties of simulation as a pedagogical tool, is that there are very few other, if any,
which
ways
kind of meshes it together.
Yeah, exactly, which combine that in a kind of realistic and kind of immersive manner. So stating those learning outcomes and having clear learning outcomes is important.
It's also an important time in the briefing for you as an educator and also the learners to come together and develop what we call a fiction contract. Because we know in reality that simulation is not real. It is a performance. It is a curated event. But we want buy-in from both parties. Yeah. We want to just say, there is going to be some limitations with the reality of things. We might not have all of the kit and equipment which we've got in practice, or the mannequin might look like a plastic dummy. But let's just pause that for a moment and just see if we can get sort of immersed in this event that's about to unfold, so that we can really get the best out of it for you as learners.
And spending that time ensuring that everybody understands what their role is and how they'd like it to play out, and whether they've got any questions about the equipment or the environment or any component, then it's an opportunity to ask those questions so that they can go in kind of with focus to try and achieve something.
So a question for you, Lawrence. If you've got a scenario where you're asking your learners to play different roles, and let's say you're asking them to play roles outside of their current level of ability, is that something that you discuss in the briefing in terms of managing expectations?
Yeah, definitely. So, sometimes the situation dictates that you need a learner to play a role that perhaps is maybe they don't fully understand, like perhaps it's another professional role, or perhaps they're being asked to play the role of often of a more senior clinician. So giving them some guidance as to what that looks like, and some kind of clarity about what the expectations are, and also to let them know that as the facilitator, if they come unstuck, then they can nudge you. And you can kind of help out. But definitely, giving that person a character role, for example, as well. If someone's playing a patient, You want to be able to give them, some basic pieces of information they're going to convey to whoever's asking them the questions, but also just maybe a quick idea about what their character is and what their mood is on that day.
So it's kind of setting the scene, if you like. Yeah.
Making it feel as real as possible within the confines of this is a learning experience and it is a simulation.
And of course, your learning outcomes might be, for example, if you've got a third year student or learner, it might be to explore these advanced roles, but in your capacity as a third year student. So there might be some expectation that you might fumble through a few things, and it's about cutting slack, isn't it? Rather than just pushing them in the deep end and expecting them to flourish in that environment.
And definitely, and also it's an opportunity, the debrief, to show that shared vulnerability. So like, I know I'm asking you to play the role of the critical care paramedic in this particular simulation. And I know that might feel a bit outside your comfort zone, but this is a new simulation that we're running today. So if you do need, to take a bit of a break, or if you want to get a bit of a steer, then, I want the simulation to go well as much as you do. So, try not to worry too much and just do the best you can.
So having that shared vulnerability is important. And we've talked in a previous episode about psychological safety. Any sort of top tips from you in terms of how to help learners get comfortable before we go into the simulation event itself?
For a start, there's a really, really good paper that I would recommend people read, which is 12 tips for the pre-brief to promote psychological safety in simulation-based education by Somerville et al.
And we'll put a link to that. And
I think going to the literature and reading what the literature says on this topic is probably the most important thing. But for me, it's about the general manner of the simulation educator more than it is anything else. Is making it okay, being open, being warm, being supportive, clearly stating that, and also embodying that basic assumption that I genuinely believe that you are capable, intelligent, care about what you're doing, and want to improve regardless of outcome.
You've got to feel it, haven't you? You can't read it like a robot off
yes,
the script.
Exactly.
I'm
You
really
are capable.
Concerned about your welfare.
Yeah, exactly. That doesn't work. It has to be warm. It has to be. You have to hold the group.
So another question for you. We got the first scenario about to start. You got your learners there, and you ask for volunteers, and everyone is just sort of like looking at how do you manage that one? I've got a few techniques that I use, but
I mean, humor is a good way of trying to break that down, and sort of. It's a tough one, isn't it? Because you're kind of conscious. You're like, well, they're only going to get more difficult.
Yeah, that's what I'd say. Like, just get the first one out of the way. That's the easy one. But it's the one that you can get wrong. That's
also problematic because what you're applying is that you're then going to beef it up for the rest of them, and I don't think that's too good. But I tend to sort of just say, look, take as long as you need.
Okay. Use the promotion of silence.
Yeah, exactly. Just allow that social pressure to build
up that psychological safety, and then just be awkwardly silent.
But it does. There are all sorts, aren't there, that participate in simulation. And what you do notice after a while is it is the same hands that come up and they want to go. And these are the generative learners.
This is the interesting thing. So if I develop scenarios, I tend to start with the most simple one. It might be just a straightforward, and then we might add complexity as we go through. But the dichotomy is you often get the most capable people putting their hands up first. And so they end up inevitably doing the simple scenarios. And when it gets to the more complicated ones, it's the
less certain.
Less certain, they struggle a bit more. So I'm still on the fence as to whether I change my format around or... Yeah. But I do use that humour of going, well... The first one's normally the simplest one. Does anyone want to have a go with it?
It's a tough one. And you've got to read the room because, the person who might be your most, vocal, confident person might not be having a great day. So I think you have to kind of play it a little bit by ear. And we have to acknowledge that not everybody is going to be involved in all of the simulations directly. And I think as long as everyone's got a role, as long as you're engaging these learners who are observing either directly or remotely, and as long as they've got purpose, then who actually does the simulation is not always the most important thing.
No, absolutely.
In fact, often not the most important thing.
Yeah, who's actively participating. So the end of the briefing tends to be the start of the simulation event. And so normally it would be some kind of handover.
Yes.
Of this is the simulation event that you're going to go into. And because it's some kind of handover, we suggest that you use some kind of handover tool to promote that, SBAR or whatever you're comfortable with delivering and using or what the learners might be using in clinical practice. It's a great opportunity to practice that, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it's a good way of kind of role modeling the use of effective handover techniques. Yeah. But also it gives us a structure as simulation educators that we know that we're going to go back to. The Research Council do this on advanced life support courses. It works well, and it allows you to kind of create a succinct handover ultimately that then kickstarts the action phase.
And I always use it as one of my secretly unintended learning outcomes, which is to demonstrate that effective communication skills and people not always talking and listening. So I'll do my S-bar handover, and then I'll put another S-bar on the back of it, which is say, back, and repeat. So I'll say, can you just say the main bits back so I know that you're happy with the scenario?
Yeah.
And you'll be amazed the amount of people who nod their heads, but are not only kind of half listening. And I'll go, this is a perfect exercise in the importance of handover.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And it might be because they're so, revved up about the fact they're about to do it, that actually giving them the chance to sort of say, look, are you sure you got this? Because you'd be good to make sure that you understand what's about to happen. And so that's a really good tip.
But that's kind of an artificial representation of what might happen in practice. So there's always useful skills. So let's move on to the simulation event itself, or the action phase. Mm-hmm. So what's the role of the facilitator once the simulation starts going? Yeah, so
for me, the role of the facilitator during the simulation is to kind of be like a curator of their ongoing learning experience. It's to guide the simulation where possible. And this person, as we've said in a previous episode, might be occupying multiple hats. They might be listening and observing and providing information potentially. They might also be adjusting observations on some kind of technological device. But primarily their role is to keep this event progressing so that it has a kind of a story element to it that can then be unpacked later in the debrief. So it's about allowing the simulation to flow and to run in line with hopefully what was expected to happen.
So again, just bearing in mind, particularly in higher education, we might be dealing with brand new learners, year one. The other end of the spectrum, we might be dealing with people who are just about to qualify. What do you do when it doesn't flow?
Yeah.
What do you do when things start getting clunky? It looks like students are out of their depth. A lot of the traditional evidence would suggest that you don't interrupt the simulation. You try and let it unfold in real time. Mm-hmm. But there's times when you feel that you have to, as a facilitator, give a nudge.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Well, I think you have to be, a part of me is always thinking, have I got the level of this right?
Okay, yeah.
Is this simulation situated right? Am I asking a bit too much? And actually, whilst I think there is value in, if you're confident that the learner group have got or have had the opportunity to have all the necessary underpinning theory and skills practice, there may be some value in allowing it to play out and then unpacking that in the debrief and saying, look, you looked quite lost from quite early on. Can you talk to us about what was happening at that time? And it might be that actually the simulation has revealed a sort of latent gap in an individual's understanding, and that's actually a good outcome.
Or a cohort.
Maybe there was a reason why this group have a deficit in this area. Maybe there's been a curriculum reshuffle, and now they don't have the theory that you thought they had. But if it's obviously heading towards, a kind of like a terminal kind of situation where it's just literally crashing and burning, the flush has gone up.
I guess in that way, the simulation event's not working, is it? It's not unfolding how you'd anticipating. So you've got to use options. Your nuance as an educator to go, I'm going to just guide a little bit, get you back on track, and then I'm going to take a step back.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got that option. You can step in to an extent and give that redirection, give that nudge, and just keep it moving again. If the kind of the stall has kind of caused an existential crisis in the learner, it might be appropriate to stop it as well and say, do you know what? Let's pick up these learning outcomes in the debrief, because there might come a point where this learner is now just not able to engage with the simulation.
And this is an extension of psychological safety, isn't it?
Yeah.
Why would you put a learner and let them just stand there and sweat for minutes, which will feel like hours, and just not say anything? Because it's not an assessment, it's an opportunity to learn.
And some people would say take a time out. So, you know, and so, you know, I at a conference a few years ago, I saw a presentation talk about tag team simulation. You know, so like, okay, let's pause there. Let's see, has anyone got any ideas who wants to kind of tag in and undertake and participate? And you can do that if you want to, as long as you're prepared to compromise on the kind of authenticity of the sim.
Yeah, I think that needs to be built into your model, doesn't it?
Yeah.
This is a deliberate, and then introduce that again as part of the briefing. You know, at any point, if you feel you're out of your depth, you can actually, in this simulation, you can tag in now. It's a bit like pausing, like you would a computer game. Yeah. Gamification is important. And actually, you know, the study's been done on deliberately making simulation hard, verging on impossible, and then debriefing and then jumping back in to try and get a little bit further each time, like you do on a computer game level, where you build up this muscle memory and you get a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further. So it's not really a technique that I've used.
No.
But the conventional approach of just letting it run from start to end of simulation, I think particularly in higher education is particularly challenging to do in some situations.
Yeah. Because this is simulation as pedagogical tool, as learning instrument, rather than as simulation as diagnostic tool and understanding exactly what's happening out there in practice. We can afford to do that. And actually, you know, as simulation educators, we are able to control time. You know, that's the thing. You can just say stop and let's carry on again in a minute.
So we've talked previously about trying to let things run out in real time because there's a value for that. But it's also important as an educator to keep to time as well where we can, because we haven't got an infinite amount of time.
No.
So you again have to sort of, the more skilled you get, the more you'll understand about where, if we need to compromise on time fidelity, we can do that, and where it's important.
Yep.
And then we need to finish and end the scenario. So we clearly need to end the scenario, don't we? How would you end it?
There's a few ways that you can do that. I've heard like phrases used, but generally I'm going to say something like, okay, everyone, thanks very much. We're going to end the simulation there.
Yeah. Nice and clear.
Nice and clear. You know, I've heard people using phrases like end X, you know, like end of exercise. That's quite a kind of, perhaps a little bit more of a sort of ambulance service thing.
Yeah, regimented kind of approach. Yeah.
But as long as there's a kind of a clear statement that says, okay, thanks very much, everybody. We'll take a breather there, or thanks very much, everybody. We're going to stop there, and now let's move into the debrief phase.
Yeah, good.
What tends to happen, and you know, we're not going to talk about debrief today, but what tends to happen, the point at which you end things, people start debriefing each other. So that's something as well that, you know, at the kind of transition phase between simulation action and simulation debrief, there's often a little kind of grey area there where I'll say something like, okay, thanks everyone. I appreciate everyone wants to debrief. If you can just start thinking about what your initial reaction is, and we'll get straight into those when we get to the debrief. So there is a kind of a blurry line, I think, sometimes a little bit between action and debrief.
Okay. So let's just go back. We've talked about it a little bit already, but I want to talk about it a bit more. Trying to address things when things go wrong, when we've got some issues. So there's different things that can go wrong, isn't there? And again, if we look at our site model, which we used when we were planning, any one of those things could go wrong, couldn't it? You know, we might end up being in the wrong room, and we've kind of planned this simulation event to be in a realistically looking hospital environment. Actually, we're in a classroom, so that's an issue. Same thing with equipment.
Yeah. So issues to do with surroundings and equipment require a bit of educator imagination to fill the gaps in fidelity.
You'd hope that you'd understand that at the briefing phase, and you can again preview that. So yeah, we don't have all the kit and equipment today, but we're going to use what we can to the best of our ability, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And, you know, you might need to have some kind of prompts or some triggers in there if there are, you know, key parts, for example, of an algorithm that a student is, or a learner is trying to navigate their way through in something, and they've just kind of come unstuck. You rather than stop everything and right, let's have a chat, you might just want to say, the next step is, you know, have you thought about just keep it moving.
Because the learners can often sometimes throw curveballs in as well that you hadn't been prepared for, and you're going to need to sort of steer back artistically to where you were. And it might just be a kind of a sort of a sort of a snapshot or a vignette of okay, this has been done, this done. We're now at this point in the simulation. Let's come back and see if we can readdress it.
Yeah, and all the while when you're observing this, you're making notes, mental notes, or perhaps physical notes about the things that are happening. So you're curating this learning experience, but you're simultaneously trying to document things that have happened so that you can pick them up in the
Which
debrief.
Is pretty challenging.
And and actually picking out some of the relation to the the intended outcomes and the unintended learning outcomes as you're going through is tricky. So yeah, it's definitely a balancing act that you need to kind of perform to keep that plate spinning and to keep it moving along.
So the other thing, again, we talked about if a learner gets stuck. So there is a couple of techniques that you can use to, again, be artistically vague with your guidance so that you're not spelling it out for them.
Yep.
One of the things you can use is PACE, which is it's actually a progressional method of communication to deal with conflict, but it again works quite nicely in this situation. So PACE, the P stands for probing. So let's use an example of a learner forgets to put on oxygen at a key point and the patient is going to be hypoxic as a consequence. So you want them to try and figure that out themselves, but equally so, if they progress too far into the simulation, it's going to get to the point where there would be detrimental effects.
Yeah.
So it needs to be addressed. So probing, you might say, at this point, is there anything that you might intervene in terms of what's happening with your patient condition?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're just kind of hinting at that. You're not spelling it out at this point, but you're trying to get the learner to problem solve themselves. If that doesn't work, then you escalate up to A, which is alert. And you might say something along the lines of, I just want to bring it to your attention that I think the oxygen saturations are currently dropping.
Is there anything you'd like to do about that?
Anything you'd like to do about that?
Yeah.
And then
I'll put the oxygen on.
You'd hope that probably about 80% of people would, if not higher, would take that little learning point and that cue to move on. But people behave in weird and wonderful ways.
Yeah, and the cognitive overwhelm, in that particular situation might be such that actually that person just goes, yeah, no, they're desaturating. Yeah, no, I know.
So the next stage, I think of probe and alert as you're putting the ball in their court. You're giving them an opportunity to problem solve without them getting egg on their face. But obviously in real clinical situations, there is a point where you have to sort of start to escalate the urgency. Yeah. So the next one is C, which is challenge. So again, in this scenario, it might be words to the effect of the O2 mask is not on the patient. I want you to tell me why that is the case. And then if they don't get that, we would, as you would in clinical practice, move to E, which is escalate or declare an emergency. And at this point, we might have to say, okay, we need to pause here and have a micro teach or a little bit of learning on it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. And that is the beauty of simulation, isn't it? That you can afford to do that. And actually, if it's a safety critical point, then it may be worth pausing the simulation at that stage. All the while, though, as the educator, you're trying to make this judgment in your head of, should I allow this to play on? To what extent should I allow this person to kind of get it wrong? Because there's pretty good evidence to say that actually it's helpful to rehearse getting things right.
Would you ever involve the peers as part of this problem solving? Throw it out there to anyone else?
Yeah, and do you know what? There's bound to be somebody who is sat in there thinking, I know exactly what I should be doing, but because this is a simulation, I don't want to ruin.
And because so-and-so was the person who took the briefing.
Yeah, exactly. So, there's an opportunity there for us to de-emphasize the fact that this one learner has, forgotten to put the oxygen on and have a conversation about distributed cognition and, the role of team in promoting patient safety and, and then we're down an unintended learning outcome about the team, which hopefully de-emphasizes, the error, if you will. I think error is probably a bit harsh in this circumstance. It's just an emergent feature of this student being overwhelmed by the situation. But you can then turn it into a different kind of a learning point. Yeah. So why would we use this escalating approach? Why do you think there's value in that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think from an educator point of view, it helps you stop going straight into problem solving and tutorial mode.
Yeah,
it can be very easy to just go, you haven't put the oxygen mask on, and if you haven't put the oxygen mask on, X, Y, and Z is going to happen, and you haven't given the learner the opportunity to problem solve. in the heat of the moment during the simulation. Of course, they might not be able to, again, because of the evaluation apprehension that they're getting during the simulation. But at least it gives them multiple opportunities to fix that problem themselves.
Yeah, exactly that. And that's the real benefit, isn't it? And it's that kind of first step as well in, Kolb's experiential learning cycle, that concrete experience. If we step in too soon, we kind of slightly diminish the reality of that concrete experience, which then may have implications for, abstract conceptualization and reflective observation later. They're going to be reflecting on the fact that they had to have a prompt rather than the fact that it took them slightly longer than they would have liked to make the realization themselves. And that's, maybe marginally less favorable as a learning outcome, potentially.
Yeah. But you need to have this preparedness of understanding if it doesn't quite go to plan, because I think one thing we can say about simulation is it inevitably something won't go to plan. There'll always be a degree of variability. No two simulations are the same.
Yep.
And
there's always a gap between simulation as imagined and simulation as done.
Yeah.
There's always that gap, and it's because it's a complex endeavor, and because individuals are unique, and because, like you say, it never runs the same way twice. We've just got to be ready to sort of navigate that, variation.
But on the plus side, it gives you ample opportunity to unpack rich learning experiences, which you'll do in the debrief, which we'll come to in the next episode.
Perfect. It's a little segue. So in summary then, the role of the facilitator is pivotal in simulation delivery, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. Yeah. And the important thing there is you've hit the nail on the head. It's facilitator, not teacher.
And as a facilitator, our inputs need to be subtle and dynamic and responsive to the situation as it emerges.
Yeah. You need to understand that not everything's going to go to plan. Mistakes are okay, both for you as a facilitator and also the learner. And if you can share those experiences, that helps to share vulnerability.
And ultimately, what we're trying to do is to curate the learning experience as a simulation facilitator, and with one eye on the intended learning outcomes, but always a watchful eye out for unintended learning outcomes, which can be just as potent.
Nice. Yeah, really nice. So we better go back to our intended learning outcomes for this episode. And they are to understand the importance of a structured approach to simulation and to describe the phases of simulation delivery.
Thank you for joining us for this special edition of SimCast. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.